And I'll hand over to you, Tom. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this seminar series organized by the Empathic Computing Laboratory. I'm your host, Aladdin, and our guest speaker for today is Tom Garner, who is currently a senior lecturer in interactive technologies. His research interest in applications of auditory perception theory. And the title of this talk is Terror Loop, Combining Auditory Perception Theory, Biosensing Technology, and Sound Design Practice to Craft Biofeedback Game Experiences. The talk will be roughly an hour, followed by a brief question and answers. Please join me to welcome Tom. Thank you, Tom, for joining us.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this. Yes, where to start, really? Broadly speaking, kind of the structure for this kind of covers kind of two kind of historical strands. One looking at kind of how the auditory perception aspect of my work has developed over the years and how that's built into a particular theory. Then a kind of a separate strand that's been more about the building of virtual reality experiences, thinking about design practice, and then those things kind of over the years have kind of merged, and then they've been integrated with seemingly in some ways connected, but very much a third strand of biosensing, of physiological data, of ways of acquiring that data and then utilizing it within these different kinds of experiences. Now, broadly speaking, it's the area of application here is games, recreational experiences, but for the most part, I'm seeing this being applied more readily in serious games applications. So, I mean, obviously, I don't have context for the type of projects that you're doing and the specifics of everyone's different interests, or even the things which you may or may not already know. So if there's any theory which you've already heard before, apologies. There's things that you already know, apologies, but I do hope that there will be some unique elements in here telling you giving you some kind of fresh perspectives on it, at least a couple of bits and pieces, whilst not throwing too much at you all in one go. Just see if it will let me change. Okay, so I will, if anyone kind of has anything, or there's anything technical, or anyone can't hear me or anything like that, please use some sort of auditory cue, because as I mentioned at the beginning, I can't see anybody. So if there's anything not working, if I don't hear anything, I am just going to continue assuming everything is all right, because at the moment I've got zero feedback. I am literally just staring at my own presentation and talking. So someone just shout at me.
Will do. It looks good now. Thank you.
Thank you. That's exactly what I need. Thank you. So I mean, I'm starting here with what is effectively a bit of a rant. So to put some things in a wee bit of broader context, particularly in virtual and augmented reality, at the very least in the UK, I won't necessarily speak for all countries around the world, but the impression that I get very much in the UK market is that there is, we still sit, if we're looking at like that Gartner's hype cycle of something being, kind of at the peak of inflated expectations before reality hits, and we realize that this new technology is nowhere near as good as we thought. There's lots and lots of hype surrounding it. In terms of the way that that's translating across various different domains, again, I'll only speak on behalf of the UK, is that there's a lot of assumption that you just use a piece of technology and that technology itself will just solve all of our problems. It's like, oh, I need to do a more efficient means of recruitment, or I need to improve my training for this in this particular domain, or I want to be able to engage people in this, or I want to create a more interesting e-commerce marketing space, or what have you. Oh, I'll just use a VR headset. Oh, I'll just make a mobile smartphone app, or what have you. And that the technology by itself, just by using that platform or using something which will run on a particular device, and that device is big in the news or what have you, that's enough. And that will do, that's all the requirement needed in order to realize the aims of whatever it is you're wanting to use this technology for. Obviously, that's not true. And when it comes to virtual reality, obviously in terms of different areas, the specifics of this are going to be very different. But in terms of virtual reality, at least, our priority, Portsmouth is pushing this idea of thinking about theoretically informed engagement. The assumption that just because it is a new and shiny technology, particularly bearing in mind these days it's not that much of a new and shiny technology, you know, particularly VR headsets, HMDs have been around quite a while. We know we're in multiple different stages of generation, of Rifts to Quests and so on. Actually thinking about the design of the experiences themselves it's already extremely important, but it's only going to become even more important as more and more people realize you can't just slap something in a headset and expect it to be automatically good. So in terms of this kind of, I'm using this as a way of kind of introducing some of the core theory, which is related to how the design strand of the talk that I'm giving, kind of where that narrative is going. And fundamentally, that comes down to various different things, but at the top of that pile is the sense of engagement. You can't assume that if you just put the headset on that it will be exciting and interesting to use. So what we try to push at various different levels, right through undergraduates, right through to research, to the research projects that we do. In fact, more in the research projects, because we tend to find that the clients and the projects that we do out in the world, they're the ones who don't necessarily recognize the value of this, whereas the undergraduates are a lot more receptive to it. But these are the kind of points that we really push. So it's finding ways of being able to generate this clear and meaningful purpose. You know, you're not just in VR to be in VR, you're in there to do something, to interact with the world in a way which is ideally both emotionally and cognitively meaningful to that user, you know, and that just cannot be achieved by automatically by putting a headset on. It should be something which utilizes more exclusive features of the technology. You know, if you are using some kind of headset, or if it was, say, the HoloLens, or if you're using even a smartphone, and there isn't really a clear reason for you to do so because the affordances of that technology are superfluous to a requirement, particularly if there are additional costs in using that platform and so on, then, you know, why are you using it? What's the particular reason for it? A lot of the times it is for its own sake. And users, they're not stupid. They're aware of that, or they will very quickly become aware of that when they actually do interact with the software that you're producing. Then, obviously, in the most objective sense, well-designed and well-constructed visual and auditory elements. We just see too many examples, again, even in professional practice and things which are out there in the world, whether they're being used for training, different forms of assessment, for medical diagnosis and so on, where the craft of it is a wee bit minimal, and there just isn't that kind of refinement in a lot of the construction of these virtual environments. So even if you put those down to objective factors, they need to be considered a wee bit more. Obviously, you've got things like management of side effects and cyber sickness, and those sorts of things can be extremely different depending on the target audience who you're working with. If you're working in a healthcare background, for example, we do a lot of things where we've got people with various different physiological conditions, and that obviously heightens the concern that we would need to have over their ability to interact. We work with a lot of older people using VR headsets and things like that. So obviously those sort of things become really important. It needs to feed back. So the design needs to be encouraging the user to be engaging physically with the system, but they need to feel some sort of sense that what they're doing is having an effect, and they need to be able to understand that effect. It needs to make them feel, and it needs to feed into these other 3 points these 4 points that we're going to briefly talking about. I'm not talking about immersion, by the way. That needs to be taken out. Immersion, I left in there purely to talk about it being something that I'm sick of it being a term anybody talks about. So whenever nearly 9 times out of 10, if someone is trying to pitch to me a rationale for using particularly a VR headset, they'll say it's because it's more immersive. Of course it is. You know, you put the headset on, you're surrounded by the environment and so on. It kind of blocks out the external stuff. It's just so par the course, I think it's lost all meaning. Whereas presence, flow, and diegesis are 3 different elements which require some effort in the design, some understanding of the human-computer interaction theory, and the user experience design theory. You need to craft those other things. Whereas the other 3 things, whereas immersion, yes, it's crafted by the technology, by the headset, but we, or at least I, am not in the business of making headsets. I'm in the business of using these pieces of hardware to craft experiences and user interactions. So in terms of presence, I mean, I won't spend too much time on these, but I did want to share some of these with you just because I found them extremely useful on multiple different occasions. And some of these particular images I found quite difficult to find. These two ones in particular, I've lost several times. You know, I've found them once and then gone, oh, these were really, really useful, and then tried to find them again because someone would ask me about presence and what it meant and whether there were different types of presence and so on. And I go, oh, actually, yeah, there's this wonderful image and I can't find it. It's quite hidden on the internet, or at least it has been the last 4 or 5 times that I've tried to find it. So it's been useful for me to have it in this talk, and I'm going to try and make sure I keep these slides accessible to myself, because I do find I use these quite often. Because a lot of the time when people think about what it means to be present in a virtual world, they tend to think it's predominantly this kind of sense of, well, let's call it physical presence. I feel like I am there, which is great, but obviously that focuses on the effect, on the feeling for the user, but that doesn't tell the designer what the route is to realizing that feeling of being there. How do you make someone feel as if they are there? And these models are very helpful because they break it down into different, you know, they explain what being there could mean, and then give some kind of indications of what the routes to being able to realize that. So, you know, emotional could be something which is obviously more to do with the narrative that you draw and the characters maybe that you create. Embodied could be more something about the nature in which it makes you use your body or think about your body. So it's not just about, so there's active as well there. So obviously just using your body a lot, and maybe in a more passive way, you're not consciously thinking about how you're using it, but you're getting your heart rate up, you are stretching, you know, you're getting more blood into your muscles, all of those sorts of things you would call active. And embodied could involve elements like that. But I think on top of that, it's more of a sense of a sense of knowing of your own body. That sense of conscious control. I don't know if anyone, a lovely example of that, if anyone's ever played Super Hot. I played it first as a first-person shooter and then played it a little bit later in virtual reality. And it is one of the few, if not the only game that I remember playing in both modes and feeling that there was a really, really significant added value to playing in VR over in terms of just the FPS mode, and it was because the time moves when you move mechanic being controlled by your head and your hands, which obviously by association could link into your arms. Even if you moved your shoulders a bit, that would nearly always have some sort of knock-on effect on your hand position, and so you had to have total awareness of your body, because you needed to use your body strategically. So there was a cognitive aspect tied in to the physicality, and you could also move up and down. That vertical axis of movement that you don't get in first-person shooters, where everything is across kind of 2 planes of movement predominantly, or you just press a button to crouch. That ability to physically duck down and control that is just something was a really unique affordance. So that is what I'm, you know, if I ever need a good example of embodied presence, is exactly what I would talk about. But this is the idea, you know, so by breaking it down into these groups, now all of a sudden you've got a wee bit more of a roadmap as a designer or someone who's developing these sorts of experiences, based on physiological factors, based on cognitive factors, based on emotional factors. Then obviously the one I didn't talk about, which is the social aspects of it, making things multi-user, using different ways and allowing multiple people to interact with each other. Obviously that's huge at the moment when it comes to, at least in the news. I mean, I may raise an eyebrow if I use the word word metaverse. Is metaverse a word or is it a phrase? I don't know, but if I was to say metaverse, some people in the audience may raise an eyebrow, and rightfully so. But obviously it's a big thing. And so matters of exploring social presence is obviously it's in the public consciousness, and it's something which is seen as particularly important. But the main idea is that with this sort of framework, you're in a kind of position to be thinking about how all these elements might work together and actually utilize that to craft an experience that responds to it. And that ultimately going to be better, than it's going to be crafted, and is going to be good. This next one is one that I would expect the vast majority of you have probably heard about before. I mean, the table on the right, I think, takes things a little bit more depth. So a lot of people who are familiar with the fundamentals of flow particularly in computer games, they may not have necessarily seen it represented in the image to the right. But broadly speaking, for those of you who haven't, it is that sense of skill against challenge, the amount of stress causing stimuli against your feeling of being able to cope with it. And I use examples as like the difference between Doom and Silent Hill. Ultimately, if you were playing a game like Silent Hill, all of a sudden you had the amount of capacity, you had the guns, the armament, the health system, and all of that of the Doomslayer in the context of the type of adversary you're dealing with in Silent Hill, is not going to work. You're going to move totally out of that flow state. And it's finding ways of thinking about, well, what are the it's thinking about affordance theory as well, which I don't go into any more detail in without this talk, because I think I'm throwing enough slides at you as it is. But that idea of how much kind of sources of stress and challenge are being put upon you, but also how much capacity, and it says skills there, but I mean, skills could be of the player, of the person, but also of the character, the affordances of them, what the game or the system enables them to do, the range of different features, and the degree of control you're actually giving them. But just because it's, you're in that flow state, what I like about this the next image to the right is that it kind of highlights that you don't need to any kind of perfect or good, well-crafted virtual environment design doesn't necessarily need to just fit in that diagonal line. There may be circumstances where actually you want to put them in an anxious state. Or you want to put them in a controlled state, So I mean, I think out of all of those, I mean, maybe this could be a point for discussion. But I mean, boredom, pretty sure most people would want to avoid that. So that kind of sense of moderate ability, but but low challenge, you'd want to avoid that. But relaxation, again, depending on the context, depends on what is the nature of this experience. What are you trying to create? And it's also worth mentioning, as we'll get to in the later slides and the main kind of case study that I wanted to show you, it's not necessarily just about the singular experience that you're creating, or sorry, the overarching experience that you're creating, the singular piece of software, the single game or the single virtual environment or what have you. But you may want them to feel to find themselves at different points around this map at different points in time within the same experience. So in order to get them to a flow state, maybe you want to move them into high anxiety first and then let them move into flow. Or maybe you want to move them into relaxation first and then move them up into flow. So do you get them really, really capable first and then build up the challenge? Or do you build up the challenge first and then move them and then allow them to slowly increase their capabilities? And is it always ultimately going towards the top right corner? Does it then shift somewhere else around the map within the experience? There's no real limits on how you would move them. But what I think the important thing that I try to impress upon people when it comes to utilizing theory effectively, when it comes to design of these sorts of environments, is to be considerate about it. What is that map, that pattern, that pathway you're trying to take the user on, and why? Why are we going to relaxation first, then up to flow, as opposed to anxiety first and then over to flow? Some of the other things that we talk about, again, I'll be a little bit more brief on diegesis, but I think it does relate to a few things that I will return to. But it's this, broadly speaking, if no one's kind of heard of it in this context, the classic example of diegesis actually is in sound, is the difference of how like music is used in things like film and television and video games. If you hear particularly a piece of music, if a piece of music feels like it's playing, is heard playing on a device within the game world itself. So if you're watching a film and you see a record player or someone's on their phone and characters on the phone and a piece of music is heard emanating from the phone, that would be diegetic music. Whereas if they're on their phone and then there's this tense orchestral score with lovely bassy sound, really full sound, really thick, and there's not an orchestra on the bus, then that's going to be extra diegetic. And what's happening here is obviously this is that kind of theory, that idea of things being in the game world or not being in the game world, as the case may be, or in the virtual world or in the narrative world or not in the narrative world, has been applied here to user interface design. So Dead Space, obviously a wonderful example of that. The idea of taking something that originally would be seen as non-diegetic or extra-diegetic, not of the narrative world. It would be in a 2D overlay. Now exists in that virtual world, and that has ramifications to the way that the game is played. So, for example, in Dead Space, you can't pause. Accessing this inventory system does not pause the game. So you're actually in a heightened, vulnerable state. So going to flow, we're moving the player intentionally into a higher anxiety state by lowering their capacity, because they're essentially very vulnerable. They need to check their inventory, but that's taking a lot of their focus and attention away from other things that are going on in the world, and they need to, because those events are still playing out. They're still at risk whilst they're doing this. Whereas if it was extra diegetic or non-diegetic, effectively it's pausing that narrative world. They can compartmentalize. They can go, okay, right, I'm not under threat from alien hordes anymore. I can just think about micromanaging my inventory. So even like the old Resident Evil games, they used to do that. It would automatically pause the environment. Dead Space decided you did not deserve that. You wanted to feel more anxiety. But obviously doing something like this keeps you in the narrative world for longer, and therefore more consistently, and that keeps you more connected to it. So its effect on creating a deep and meaningful cognitive, but also affective connection to the virtual environment can be particularly significant. And in virtual reality in particular, head-mounted display virtual reality, that becomes even more pivotal, because you can't really do 2D overlays in the first place. So creating a heads-up display, creating a 2D UI is going to be increasingly difficult, is borderline impossible in those kind of headsets, because having that right up to your eye is very difficult to use. So it nearly always needs to be projected out into the world. And ideally, again, because you're not using a traditional WIMP, a mouse pointer interface, you're not using a 2D interface or a controller interface in order to interact with, or method of interaction to interact with this user interface space. You're using your hands, you're reaching out. So your interaction with most menus is now going to be in the 3D. So it makes sense that the way that they're presented is in the 3D. So there's been an awful lot of kind of redesign or reapproach to design of user interface systems because of the new technologies and the affordances of those new technologies in things like the head tracking and the hand tracking of virtuality systems. And they tie into this idea of diegesis. And that can be extended even further. There are these, I'll try and stop now and move on to the next thing, but there are things like trans diegesis. So and then when I mentioned about the flow state, that can change over time. So can diegetic. You could take a piece, they do this in film all the time. You have a piece of music which has like an effect on it. So it sounds like it's coming from a stereo within the world, and then they kick the bass in. And now all of a sudden it's gone from being a diegetic sound to being an extra diegetic sound. Or they do it in comedy where you can hear this beautiful score being played and you assume it's non-diegetic, and then the camera pans out and there's an orchestra where you didn't think there was. Something you previously thought was non-diegetic becomes diegetic. And that can apply to the use of other sorts of interactions as well. So it's not just limited to music. It's not necessarily just limited to user interface design as well. It can be expanded to other different things, but it creates this connection between design and cognition and emotion and interaction. All of those things are all more deeply connected, and that's what makes diegesis feed into engagement. Again, at least according to this theory and our belief in it and how we utilize it. I will stop now because this is just kind of restating things that's already been said. This is an example of just it being used in terms of teleportation. So that example on the left, we would probably argue would be extra diegetic, because it is very much, even though it's 3D, it's not really of the narrative. The character doesn't really have the ability to teleport around, but we have to give the player the ability to teleport because it's one of the most effective means of moving around a space. Whereas these all the other examples effectively make it diegetic by putting it in a narrative context. So Skyrim, it's magic, and Doom, it's magic as well, somehow kind of like science-y magic. And then in budget cuts, there's like a technological, it's fictional obviously, but there's a technological justification or rationale for it being the way it is. So it's more integrated, and broadly speaking, those tend to be systems which are more highly regarded and more effective. So taking it a wee bit away from the design and then thinking about some other things that do connect into this, but some other areas of theory. I'm also kind of conscious of time that I can't see the time. I'm just, so apologies if I stop every now and again just to make sure I'm not going over or under too much. A few different things that I just did want to point to that have fed into the auditory perception side of things. The first one of these is this idea of embodied cognition. So the table on the left is not embodied cognition. The idea of that is that sense of more of a dichotomy, of a separation between the mind and the body and the rest of the environment. So we experience the environment, and then we go through various different cognitive, psychological processes that are effectively disembodied. And then we translate that into a decision to create an action, and then that action has some sort of effect on the environment. Now, there's obviously elements of truth to that. No one's necessarily saying that all aspects of that are inappropriate. The idea that we create representations, rules, models, and frameworks, not necessarily we are not necessarily saying that isn't the case. But if you've not heard of embodied cognition, what it tends to argue against is that separation down the middle. And it acknowledges things which the disembodied model doesn't. So it very much separates this idea of brain and mind. And broadly speaking, could even be taken as far to say that the mind doesn't exist. It itself is an illusory construct of the brain. But the brain is an important part. The physicality of the brain is an important part. And the brain exists within the body, and the body is physical, and the physicality of the body is an important part. So it's not just our minds in relation to the environment, it's our minds mediated by the brain, mediated by the body, mediated by the environment. All of those things happen together. And that does tie into what I've been talking about earlier about feeling, about diegesis, about flow state, about particularly presence. And feeling physically, emotionally, cognitively connected to a world. If you think about things in a more embodied term, that totally makes sense. It really does connect to that idea of thinking about how these technologies can be used to make us use our body more, to make us more aware of our body, and for that to give us a deeper sense of meaning and connectivity to the environment and what we are doing within the environment. And what we, in our own research, what we did, so this is going back to 2016, was to take some of that and apply it. So this was nothing to do with virtual environment design. This was very much in trying to just make sense of what sound meant. But what we found is that ultimately you could apply this to pretty much anything. But the fundamental principle is there, and it's based on this idea of seeing this brain and brain within body within environment. So you have these physical components that both external are out in the world, and then that are kind of internal to you, to your physicality, but that are still affecting your experience of whatever is in that center. And we use this particular imagery here to kind of illustrate this this idea that what we're actually, the subject of whatever it is we're talking about or experiencing, is ironically the one thing that doesn't exist, or in some ways exists the least, or in the least physical sense. We don't want to get too metaphysical or philosophical about the whole thing, but the broad terms is that it is this emergent experience, what we experience as a sound, or what we experience as an image, or what we experience as a game. You could think more high level or low level, or more in components, or what we think of as an interaction or a meaning or whatever. Literally anything could replace the word sound in this model. But it is this emergent, almost some might say illusory thing, which arises based on these other physical components. And ironically, it's the more physical components that we don't notice, and it wouldn't be very efficient for us to notice them. We need to see the picture that emerges from the pattern. If we just saw all of the individual dots, it would be like looking at this screen and just being able to see the pixels, but not being able to form the image from it. Wouldn't be particularly effective. So this kind of model could be applied to lots of things, but the point is to try and highlight what those pixels, those components, those aggregate elements are that come together to create this actualization, this emergence of what the user, the player, or what have you experiences and what they interpret, because those are the things we can control as designers. Or some of them. We can't necessarily control the physiology of the user, although to some extent we can maybe dictate certain requirements, maybe in the same way, a roller coaster says you can't ride it unless you're a certain height. But things like perceptual components, as we'll get to in a moment, there's the potential, particularly in terms of if you think about it in more of a long term of an experience, there is a potential for us to be influencing those as well. So it's not just the virtual environment and its core elements, the obvious stuff which we have control over. There may be things which indirectly, through kind of like creating these loops, we might actually be able to manipulate even further. So that then kind of expanded out to things like this, where it's like, an excuse, it does get gloriously messy, and I'm not talking through all of these points individually, but this was just kind of raised that sense of how complex things got very, very quickly. This is probably not even remotely comprehensive either. This was just my attempt of creating an initial framework to try and give my own mind as a designer a sense of, well, what things do I need to think about when crafting an experience and crafting an interaction? And if I want the experience, and if I want the experience that I have in my own mind and the effect of that experience to match what actually happens for the user and the way they actually experience it and the meaning they derive from it, and whether they say that it's good or what have you. Sorry, it's just if I get some messages, I'm just very quickly just double checking it's not someone saying I can't hear or anything like that. Yeah, there's so many different things going on, and obviously no one would be saying that you would need as a designer or a developer or even as a team to be aware of all of these things. Is it really that does it matter that much about the sobriety of the user, the current intoxication level of the user? Potentially not, but potentially so. You know, that any of these things could theoretically feed into the nature of the experience. So it's something which I found very useful to just, once I've designed at various different stages of the design and development cycle, to just kind of sit back and stare at it and be like, are there any of these things that I've not thought about that I probably should think about? You know, just kind of go through them. And some of those things will be really important. Like, yeah, I've got that. That's important. That's important. And occasionally it just reminds me that there is something I've not thought about. Oh, actually, yeah, that could be important. It gives you that wider context. It helps you check that you've not missed anything. Okay, so what we're doing now is kind of flicking backwards and forwards in time. This is now going back to some of my initial PhD work, where what I was really thinking about was horror games, and I was interested in sound design, but specifically sound design as it was pertaining to horror games. What I wanted to do was scare people. So I was interested in exploring what kind of the nature of fear within a game experience was, because obviously it's not necessarily going to be exactly the same as fear in the real world, but there is going to be overlap. But what exactly is the nature of it, and can I understand that better so that I can actually, you know, use this theory to better inform the methods that I'm using to scare people. And a couple of things that I draw attention to, again, lots of information here. But the main kind of areas I want to draw attention to is that sense of priming was one of these initial theories to I think this is an unrefined theory at this stage. Obviously, it's quite old now, but I think the notion of priming still has a certain degree of relevance. The idea that you can't just simply put a player in an environment and put a jump scare in and then, oh, yeah, there you go, they'll jump out of their skin. Some people will, but the vast majority, particularly obviously the more quote unquote hardened they become based on prior experience, and again, flow state, the feeling of capacity, being able to deal with threat, and which again overlaps with some of these things we've got here about accepting something a threat and then how you feel you can deal with and manage that threat. Is it an immediate threat? All of those sorts of things. You can prime them. And it's about kind of initially creating this sense of a safe space and then moving them through the stages in order to really make sure that they're as again, going back to embodied cognition, as physiologically prepped for it as well. Ideally, you want the heart rate, or again, theoretically speaking, there is an optimal heart rate. It could be a personalized thing, but an optimal heart rate to have somebody in an optimized physiological state for them to be in before you drop, you know, that bomb, and you're right, there you go. You know, you don't just hit them straight away. And going back to what I mentioned a second ago, that idea of it being personal very much feeds into, you know, not all heart rate, you know, you don't just get it to, you know, heart rate of 100 and then, oh, that's the perfect heart rate. Now you can drop your you can drop your jump scare and it will be 100% effective. The ideal state is going to be different for different people. Again, going back to those previous maps, it's messy. So having any way of generating data which can cut through that mess a wee bit is going to be useful. This one is effectively an elaboration, so there may be things that we can go back to if anyone has kind of any questions on. But effectively, what I'm talking about here is kind of taking this previous model, which was just about trying to make sense of what fear was, and then apply it to the game world environment. So if we then consider that sense of priming and the differences between feeling cautious as opposed to feeling terrified, as opposed to feeling horrified. And by the way, terror was seen as, broadly speaking, something which is chasing you, and horror is seen as something which jumps out at you. It's a horrifying response when it's a startle, whereas terror is usually like, if you've ever played Amnesia or something where you're being chased, that's normally how terror was defined in these contexts, just sort of make that clear. But yeah, this was about taking the same sort of thinking around priming, but then putting it into a game world context. But the next step, so again, you see the dates increasing there. The next step really was thinking about that issue of personalization. Obviously, not everybody is going to be primed at exactly the same time. So what can we do in order to try and determine when someone is perfectly primed? Now, I don't think that this strand of research really got to fully answering that question, because unfortunately that raised initial questions we needed to answer before. So we, about the nature of the data and about those measurements, how do we even reliably define, how are we going to put this framework together? How do we reliably define terror in physiological terms as opposed to horror in physiological terms, or when someone is scared enough, the right amount of scared as opposed to the wrong amount of scared? Particularly, what about context? How do all of those sorts of things feed in? So there was an excuse to lots and lots of studies, but that did involve excuses to make games in order to grab testbed materials in order to create some data. So I can't say I didn't enjoy my PhD. I've got to make lots of game mods as part of my work, which was fun. I enjoyed that. If you can find it, if anyone is a PhD student and you like making games, find a way to find an excuse to get that into your work. It worked extremely well for me, so I strongly recommend it to anybody. But the idea here, so this is a mod using the CryEngine 2, I think it was at the time, but it was, or CryEngine 3 maybe, but for the game Crysis 2. So some of you may even recognize some of the mods from it. Some of the assets from it. But the idea broadly was that, it was a custom-based experience where various different things would happen. And then I got to wire people up to, in this case, electromyography. So muscle sensors, it was all facial electromyography. So they had sensors on what was called the zygomaticus major. So which effectively they're kind of like their smile is known as the smile muscle, but effectively it was the wincing muscle. If you're like, you would tend to kind of clench your jaw, but raise raise this part of your face a wee bit. So we'd have a couple of sensors there. And then there was, I believe, the corrugator supercilli, which was a couple of sensors just here, which was your frowning muscle. Usually when things were really bad, this bit would be activated. When things were just a wee bit bad, this would be activated. But the idea that top level that you can see, the one which is a lot messier, a lot noisier, that was the EMG. And then GSR, the galvanic skin response, was basically the sweat conductance, effectively, how much you were sweating in your hand. And that was being measured at the bottom. And the idea was to quite broadly, I won't go into fine print of looking at data or anything like that, but I found the overview, the visualization of it quite useful, because it revealed certain ways in which people would respond. The measurements would pick up different types of scary experience. So whereas EMG was much better for startle response, so when there was that sudden heavy breath, you can see there's this big spike at just before 253 seconds, and that's picked up in the EMG, but the GSR doesn't really change at all. Whereas towards the end, where the tension is slowly increasing and we're moving through these priming stages towards a sense of, this build-up, there's this slow building dread that clearly at the end, something's gonna happen. And it's anticipation and expectation that's building up and building up. That's not obviously represented a great deal in the EMG, but it is represented very well in the GSR. So depending on what measure you were using, it was finding it was useful for different bits and pieces. Now, again, I think I've overshot it again. I always worry that I'm going to under-prepare rather than over-prepare. And I want to give a moment just to kind of finish off with the case study. So I won't spend too much. I know I've said this before, but I'll try to be quick with these. And obviously, these are the notes and stuff you can kind of look back on. But I found this useful both for myself for reference, but also for various other people when it comes to considering how they might be using various little bits of these sensing technologies, not predominantly in the way that we just talked about in terms of data acquisition for research purposes, but actually now for biofeedback. So where the system is actually going to take it that step further, use those physiological inputs, interpret meaning from those physiological inputs, and then translate that meaning into a change in the actual virtual environment design, actually change something of the virtual world in response to it that will hopefully change the emotional state, the affective state, or the cognitive state of the user, which will in turn change their biosignals, which will in turn change the environment. Loop and loop and loop and loop and loop. So obviously that's what I'm talking about when I say biofeedback, and that's where an awful lot, particularly our usually MSCs, master's students, are really into this. They really find the idea of developing their own bespoke biofeedback systems really intriguing. So what I put together was kind of a rundown based on our own experience of the various projects we've run about certain ways in which of the various different types of biofeedback hardware solution you could use, what the kind of the broad features and then the relative advantages and disadvantages are. I won't go through them all individually. I will just try and look at the image and just try and think of the one thing which immediately comes to mind as the biggest factor. So in terms of using voice, which is actually what we're going to talk about in the case study at the end of the talk, I very much rate it. That use of sound and voice, I think, is extremely powerful, both as a means of controlling the virtual environment consciously, but also yielding affective data by actually some sort of an analysis system, which is able to get a sense of how loud you're speaking, but also kind of like the pulling out elements of timbre in your voice, the qualitative aspects of your voice to interpret your affective state. Because obviously most people wear these sorts of peripherals already, so there's no new hardware that's required or anything like that. There's various reasons why I very much rate it. But obviously there are other options, and some of these do exist in the consumer domain as well. They're not just purely the realm of research. There are devices out there, including wireless devices, which can take muscle stimulation. Predominantly, you've got these kind of, usually wristbands is quite prominent, which can be problematic if the means of interaction is based on using your hands and your arms, and you'd be activating these muscles anyway. But again, this then tends to think out how this now features more into conscious control. The user is using it intentionally rather than it being used to passively, in the background, to get this information, interpret it, and change the environment in a way that the user doesn't quite know what's going on, but it is having an effect, and ideally an effect which is making the experience better overall. Then you've got things like electrocardiograms, so various different forms of heart-related activity, heart rate variability, and so on. Obviously, very low invasive. A lot of people, myself included, I think I literally have exactly the same smartwatch, which is which is on there. They forget they're wearing them. It can collect that data really nicely in the background. But there are limitations. Usually there tends to be this kind of invasiveness versus richness of data trade-off. The more you have to wire them up, and the more aware they are they're wearing something, usually the richer the data set, the less invasive and easier to forget about it is, the less rich or exciting or useful it can tend to be. There's always these obnoxious trade-offs. So it's always so everything needs to be thought of in context. What exactly is it you're trying to do? This next one, which again is an important one because it relates to the case study we're talking about. So electroencephalography, it's quite hip. I think in the biofeedback world, it's still got this reputation as being the cool one because it's brain waves, and isn't that exciting? And I must admit, as a PhD student all those years back, I was totally like, oh yeah, brain waves, that's so cool. I really want to use that form of biosensing, that of psychophysiology. I find that really interesting, and I still do. The only thing I would say as a caveat to this is that it's a pain in the backside. The actual process of implementing these systems, of just even as a consumer, just putting that emotive epoch if anyone's put one of those on the head before, you'll know what I'm talking about. That one, it's extremely uncomfortable, and two, it's just a pain getting all of the sensors to effectively to touch the scalp. And that's, even if you have no hair on your head, it can be difficult to get full connectivity. If you have thick hair, wow, it's an absolute nightmare. But once it's on and it's working, particularly the perceptual effect of feeling like the system is reading my mind and then it changing elements of the game environment. It may be a placebo effect, but I've noticed it for a lot of users. It's extremely powerful. And then we've talked about this previously, or in that other example, that idea of using GSR. This is quite nice. Obviously it's long term. It's not going to give you acute responses to acute changes. It give you a broad sense of how maybe stressed or relaxed someone is feeling in larger epochs of minutes rather than seconds, but that could be extremely useful. And in terms of application, you can, for the most part, you just strap it onto the finger, or there's the wrist, or it can even be a lot of smart devices that are just wrist worn can integrate EDA or GSR readings or whatever into them, as well as the cardiovascular stuff. So it's nice and low invasive. People can forget it's there. So I do still very much rate that particular measure. And then there are various other things that are non-touch. So there's eye tracking. I think that's the next one. Yeah, there's like eye tracking, motion tracking, things which are a bit more at a distance. I don't think I've got really kind of time really to unpick these, but again, broadly speaking, there are advantages to using these, particularly in terms of being low invasive, but it absolutely depends on what it is. What's the context? What are you trying to do? Because obviously you're not just limited to using one of these in some sort of biofeedback experience. You could be using multiple. So it's about how you're using them in context. Let me just check. Okay, so 10 minutes, we should be about right. So I'm just kind of finishing up really about one kind of final case study, which is relatively recent. And it was about trying to think about bringing all of this together. So all of the biosensing, the biofeedback stuff, the theories of embodied cognition and emergence, and then sound, how sound was focusing into all of this, because without focusing it on one particular modality, there was just so much to think about. It was very, very messy. So just to make it so that it was a little bit more manageable and the projects we were doing were a bit more in scope, it made an awful lot of sense for me to bring the sound element back in and use that as a way of kind of refining the focus down a little bit. So what ended up coming out of it was two different kind of broad schools of thought for how sound and biofeedback could be connected. And the first of which was called Augmented Sonic Virtuality, which is the idea of using physical data to affect the sound in the virtual world. So the sound that we are hearing in this context is sound coming from the speakers or through our headphones. It's sound that's of the virtual world. It's it's processed sound or what have you, but it's been mechanically reproduced. Or artificially reproduced. I don't want to get bogged down in semantics, but it's of the virtual world, but it is responsive to various different real world factors. So predominantly we are talking about kind of, if it's in virtual reality, we're talking about being able to use like head tracking. There's all that wonderful data being generated by the ability to move your head around and to move your arms around, but we could also be combining that with those various psychophysiological, those biosensing measures, connecting those little bits of information, and then changing the sound environment. So some examples of that, I mean, I've put on there already, and no one's actually, I don't have an example of this yet. Now, maybe someone has actually done this, and if they have, I'd like to see it, and if they want to do it and they do it, I'd love to see it. But the idea of having someone play as, say, like a robot, and as they move their arms and their head around, then you get all the words, all of the but it really is accurately mapped to the nature of their movement, so depending on maybe what axis of movement of orientation is being moved, and the rate of movement, that will affect very neatly the pitch and the velocity and the intensity, various different kind of acoustic parameters of the sound to really make it one-to-one match. But I also like the example of something just like more of a Dark Souls, or kind of a historical thing, but fantasy sort of thing, where you're just a knight with a chainmail armor, and that's on your head as well. And as you move your head around, the sound really is more accurately mapped to that movement, or kind of reflecting the materialistic qualities and those sort of things. So that's, broadly speaking, techniques related to augmented sonic reality. And then this one, these are pretentious and overwritten terms, I apologize. But sonically augmented virtuality is now this kind of flipping that kind of the other way around. And now, rather than being virtual sound, we are talking about sound which is of the physical world, of the real world, of the player's world, the space in which I'm currently standing right now, to affect the virtual world in real time. So that could involve using, the human voice, but it could be also sensing sound just from the environment, the ambient environment, potentially. So examples of that were the idea of the player using their voice to distract an enemy in AI, so in the same way that classic throw the rock in an FPS in order to get, or in a stealth game, stealth FPS, to get the player to go over there, the enemy to go over there so you can sneak past. You could kind of literally do what they do in movies and just peer around a corner and go, oi, and then very, very quietly move over that way. And that the AI obviously will hear your actual voice and move across. Now, I know there are examples of that already in, kind of actually out there. I'm aware of like the modified versions of things like Alien Isolation, where it uses the microphone in certain ways. There's room to refine that, but those sort of things are starting to see, actual commercial usage. It's quite experimental usage. It's not like it's an everyday thing, but it makes for great YouTube videos, put it that way. So those sorts of things are definitely starting to move into the public consciousness, but they're just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the actual techniques that could be done. I think thinking more creatively, this opens up a far wider range of different techniques and experiences that could be built. And then just one last, as we are going, we're getting right towards the end, the top of the hour. Just finish on the demonstration for the latest case that they did. Now, this is a couple of years ago, and it's, I don't know, as with any kind of creative project, as the time passes, you increasingly think, it's less refined than I remember it being. I thought this was great at the time. It's okay. And I think that there's definitely lots of room for refining this and for developing the technique a wee bit further. But broadly speaking, and I'm conscious that I shouldn't speak too much about it because the video itself that I've got is one that I took from YouTube, that I put on YouTube, but I ripped it back off. Because it has a voiceover. It's effectively a let's play with me talking through it for my research students about the design that went into it and the approaches. So if I basically explain everything now and then I play it, you'll end up having to listen to it twice. So what I'll do is play the video, and then if it leaves any blanks, then I'll fill those in. Okay. So a couple of things just very quickly talk about in terms of that opening sequence. Obviously, with these sort of games, whenever there's any kind of novel interaction, it becomes extremely important to have some sort of kind of instruction. Ideally, that instruction wants to be what we call kind of integrated instruction. It's something which you experience during the game rather than something you'd have to read in a readme file or anything like that. But obviously, anything which is using any kind of novel interaction, you need to try and make that accessible as possible. The minute you add these kind of new features that people are very new to a lot of people, they're going to struggle with them. You need to make it as clear as possible, but also to get that information across efficiently. So that's what that integrated instruction is trying to achieve. Now, just a couple of things in terms of kind of what you can see basically kind of around you. The emphasis on these types of projects which we work on, same kind of projects that we'd be encouraging you to do, is proof of concept. It's taking something novel and trying to develop a particular idea. It's not about making AAA experiences, particularly not about making something from scratch. So any existing assets that you can bring together in a coherent sense that are absolutely fine. There's no problem with that at all. So some of you may even already recognize this particular kind of simply from an existing asset pack. The entire house is lifted from an asset pack. The positioning of all of these pieces of furniture that you can see, the television and so on, is all taken from one place. The video of the jellyfish is taken from a separate place, and there is this wonderful plugin which I was able to get and was at one point available on the application. Wonderful reflection effect. That's lovely. Okay, that's very nice. Okay, so just wandering around the house. There's just one thing before I actually kind of start the game proper to kind of draw your attention to, which is the biometric interface. Okay, so, wow. But with the biometric interface, which I am actually currently wearing, obviously it's not possible for me to kind of on command come across as stressed or unstressed. It may just turn on and off kind of seemingly at random when I'm first starting the game. Obviously, the idea is as the game develops and the environment kind of ramps up the stress levels, you would find that would respond to that. Obviously, if I've designed the game, it's a little bit different. It's difficult to be scared by your own game. So what I've done is just kind of attach it's just shortcut basically the stress and non-stress threshold to the Z and X keys. So when you're pressing, then I can simulate that particular effect. The principle was basically very simple. Whenever you're not stressed, when you walk around certain areas of the environment, more or less nothing happens. When you are stressed, you're basically a little bit clumsy. Instead of someone walking through there, but whilst I'm stressed, I'm clumsy. Over here, I've knocked that over. And when you're clumsy, you knock things over. That makes sound, and that's all about alerting your presence. Alerting the AI to your presence, which so let's just follow the hints and see what we're supposed to do. In development and testing, we found that having some sort of hint menu, which was optional, was very preferable. You didn't want something which was just constantly telling you what to do straight away, but if someone was lingering for too long in a particular space, then a hint menu usually prompted them to the next point of play, but giving them the additional option of just being able to press H whenever they need to access it, just in case they missed that first hint when it came up automatically, was always very helpful. Living rooms. The idea with this here is to try and use kind of sound to draw attention. Obviously, there's only a small visual change when this message comes up to tell you what to do next. So it was really important that we were able to use something to grab the player's attention and make them look in that particular direction. So that makes sound, make that beep. Found very effective for most players when they walked past that. The minute they heard it, it was to the right and saw the screen. So now, once we actually get to the point where I'm summoning the creature, should we say, the problem that we have is that it responds to my voice, and obviously I'm using my voice to explain kind of what's happening at the same time. So the challenge that I'm going to have is being able to somehow continue to play this game effectively whilst still talking to you, because whenever I raise my voice, it will hear me, and it will come find me. But we'll carry on playing. We'll see how we manage to get that. Summoned. Well, I'm talking now, so it's just there. Code that we need. Pretty sure it's turned me into now, basically tracking me. So whilst I basically run around in circles with it chasing me, it's got a relatively simple AI system behind it. Basically, anything which is immediate forward vision, it will see and it will chase for a certain period of time. You get too close, but generally behind it, it will still sense you, so you just can't get too close in any circumstance. If you're basically, whilst I'm talking, if my desk reaches certain thresholds, then it hears me and it will basically track and just follow it. But what I can do, and this is the trick, is way to mislead. So that makes that where I also make samples. So I can basically make noise, get it to follow me, then stay quiet if I can, and move on to the next place. And then it finds some time to do that easily there, so she can stay close. And there we go. Okay, I should be able to just kind of hopefully stop the show, leave the summary up, just kind of like points of discussion if anyone does have any further questions. These are kind of like the main topics that I'd kind of talked over. But hopefully there's a way for me to now just, so you should be able, you can see all the stuff around it, but hopefully that's still clear enough. And then, yeah, if anyone has any questions, thank you very much for that. Sorry, it's a couple of minutes over.
Thank you, Tom. That's a very interesting talk. I have a few questions, but let me ask if anyone has any question from the audience.
I have sort of a question.
Please, Amit.
Yeah. I think there's, like Aladdin said, the talk was great, and there's actually a huge amount of overlap with the work that we do at our lab. But my question, I guess, specifically is, and this is something I've been struggling with for a few months now, is have you yourself done something or come across maybe experiments where people have tried to measure the effect of sound on empathy? So this is probably looking at, sort of human interaction, maybe mediated by computers, maybe mediated by robots, whatever it is. Because I mean, anecdotally, there's enough evidence saying, there's this certain kind of music that plays in movies and films, and it evokes a certain sense of empathy, maybe towards the character. But I haven't been able to find too much of it in literature. And is this something that you've thought of, or is this something that you've tried before with the biosensors?
Interestingly enough, no. No, there's been nothing which I've seen myself that has explicitly explored that. I mean, there's only so much extent that I've looked into it. I mean, the empathy has come up various different times in a number of different projects, predominantly in the way that you've mentioned, was that kind of connection or identification with a particular character. But also it's what it's tied into has been, so we use Virtuality for quite a few what are called empathetic skills training solutions. The most recent one that we did was for dentistry. So it was using VR as a role-playing scenario, but whereas you role-played as the patient rather than as the dentist. So it was for dentists or trainee dentists to use, but they were role-playing in VR as the patient. And then it was exploring various different ways in that context of being able to help empathize with the patient experience. But I mean, even in that instance, so whilst we were trying to generate empathy in a virtual environment context, it was, in terms of sound, I mean, sound was actually the biggest component, but it was speech. And in terms of speech, it was about tone of voice. So they ended up making me play the dentist, which was totally hilarious. But apparently I've got a very impatient and miserable voice. So it worked very effectively as far as they were concerned, because they wanted this to be giving the player, even though they were actually trainee dentists and they were very near completion. They wanted to give them that sense of really empathizing with the patient because they really disliked the dentist, and they appreciated how the way that it wasn't just the words, it was very much how he was speaking. So his tone of voice, the tempo of the whole thing, the idea that I was clearly very impatient, that I was speaking very, very quickly. And there was this clear affective communication, or even if it was subconscious, of like, oh God, yeah, you know, there's just another stupid patient who doesn't understand the thing. I'm explaining the same thing again and again and again. So there was this kind of thought about the emotions that the dentist is unwittingly communicating through voice. But even that, I mean, that wasn't at the time. It wasn't based, at least as far as I remember, on any actual research. This was all based on direct observations taken kind of anecdotally from dentists. We designed the system in collaboration with various different dental academies, including the King's College one in London. And we spoke to lots and lots of dentists at different stages in their careers. And that put together the information about how the sound could generate the kind of empathetic response we wanted to generate. But I appreciate that's very practical, that's not theoretically based, and that's not very applicable to anything else. It was very, very context specific. So I don't know how useful any of that I just said is, but that's actually the extent of it. So what I haven't seen is something which explores that from a more widely applicable, generalized perspective and tries to create a framework which could maybe think about particularly sound outside of the human voice. I've not seen anything at all at this stage. I haven't personally seen anything.
Yeah, because I mean, just the going by, I mean, the definition of empathy, saying, you know, whatever, walking a mile in a person's shoes, or being able to see from their perspective and feel from their perspective. But I guess what I am struggling with, especially with sound, is the measurement of empathy, simply because it's, I guess, for lack of a better word, just like an ethereal concept. And so how do we measure it using the physiological sensors? So, but you haven't used physiological sensors with the study that you just mentioned?
No, I mean, that's a good point as well. Yeah. So I mean, in terms of then getting the feedback, the actual data to discern, well, you know, did we generate empathy or not? It was all qualitative, all subject to user reporting. In terms of actual reliable, you know, kind of physiological markers of empathy, that's a wonderful question. I have absolutely no idea. I don't know what those markers could be. I mean, I can imagine it would, the system would need to be sophisticated. It would need an awareness of context somehow, which I suppose that's like somehow, but that's not necessarily that difficult. You know, you can, the system can know an awful lot about, a virtual environment particularly can know a lot about itself. So it may be quite possible for an automated system to contextualize physiological data to try to get an empathetic response, to try and discern empathy. But I mean, beyond even then, I mean, the user response was quite challenging. And obviously, when we published the work, there was that sense of, in terms of limitations, of saying, well, what do we even mean by more or less empathy? Or what's good empathy or bad empathy, or the right kind of empathy or the wrong kind of empathy? How are we classifying and characterizing what empathy means beyond that classic, as you said, that classic definition of walking a mile in another person's shoes? How do you know that it's having the effect that we want? What does a 5 out of 10 rating for empathy as opposed to a 2 out of 10 empathy mean? Broadly speaking, what we tended to find was that it was so it was still subjective user response, but it wasn't necessarily self-report. So the users would be asked a series of to just basically consciously comment on what they felt the person was feeling, and to interpret their state of mind, what their apprehensions were at that point, what their main points of concern were. Now, obviously, we generated these scenarios based on data from real-world patients. So in that sense, we kind of knew, in a way, what the reasons for what those patients were feeling and why they were expressing themselves in that way and feeling that certain way. So we had some sort of baseline to be able to then, you know, speak to these dentists before they undergo the training and say, what do you think this patient was thinking? Of which it didn't need to be very complicated in this context, because most of them just went, I don't know, bit scared. You know, their emotional intelligence in that regard, their empathetic skills were relatively basic, so there was lots of room for maneuver there, lots of room for improvement, I should say. So it didn't need to be that sophisticated. But there was usually that before and after thing. So we used effectively performative measures, you know, or ways of assessing them afterwards and saying, you know, what do you now interpret their emotional state to have been? And then you can obviously do a before and after comparison. But in terms of translating that to biosensing, I don't know. I mean, I love that as a question. Instinctively, I feel that it absolutely could be possible, particularly if the system can know enough about itself to put it into context. But the specifics of it, I'd have to think about that. But that's a wonderful question. That's a wonderful idea for a project, I would say.
Yep. Cool. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, Tom. Anyone, any question? Okay, I have a question about the diegesis. Is that how you say it? Sorry. So
Yes.
how does the sound design be represented in a good, like if we had, is it a spectrum, like good diegesis and or bad diegesis, or not enough diegesis? How do you measure that with respect to sound, and how does that feed into engagement, as you mentioned?
That's a good question. And I would say that's, you know, there's definitely no such thing as generically good or, you know, or non-context specific good diegesis or bad diegesis. It absolutely depends on what the effect is that you're going for. So, you know, in the same way when I talked about like film and the idea of kind of presenting a sound which at first appears diegetic and then you zoom out and it's not, you know, that's classic fourth wall breaking, which is predominantly useful in comedy, you know, and whereas using it in drama would be completely inappropriate in most cases. I mean, there may be interesting ways of being able to do it, but actually, I mean, interesting enough, the term interesting, I think, is a key element to this, because you can diegesis can very much feed into expectation. And so therefore you can use knowledge of that expectation to subvert that expectation. Again, it depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to just make something, a piece of software, say that's just very usable, then the nature of diegesis is going to be very, very different. In fact, for the most part, having anything which is diegetic, that it would, from a more utilitarian and functional perspective, then it absolutely depends on where do you want the user to feel present. Do you want them to feel present in the virtual world, or do you want them to feel kind of that they exist outside of the virtual world, but they're interacting with this virtual thing? You know, so I mean, hence, you know, so a lot of like smartphone applications, most people, they either don't have any sound anyway, or it is very basic 2D UI, non-diegetic interface sounds. It's not designed to draw anyone into the world, because essentially for those purposes, you want to stay outside of it. That's also similar to the difference in virtual reality and augmented reality. In many cases with augmented reality, again, depending on your application, one of the classic applications of AR is scene analysis, is having like so you have the HoloLens or something on, and then that's collecting visual data from the scene, or various topographical data from the scene of the real world, and then channeling that and translating that into like a digital overlay to give you an additional layer of digital data to help you understand, to improve your situational awareness. But you need to be aware of but by situational awareness, it's awareness of the physical situation, the real world. The last thing we want in that context is sounds that are dragging you into a diegetic fictional world. All of the sounds need to make sure you are very much in the real world, so they need to be designed to fit for that purpose. And in many of these cases, things like using the HoloLens for scene analysis and stuff, most examples I've seen have little to no sound in them at all. When it is a more either, you know, when there is clearly a fictional world, when it's something a bit more creative, something which is more narrative driven, when it's immersive, we want to immerse them surround them in virtual content, and then we want them to feel present in that virtual world. Then, you know, having anything non-diegetic could broadly be bad, because that just pulls you out of the scene. I mean, even in cinema, there are certain cinematic schools of thoughts that say you shouldn't be using a soundtrack. You know, every piece of music you hear should exist within the world, because the minute you play something which is extra diegetic, it will pull them out of that experience. Obviously, that's not totally true, but the reason that's not totally true is because we've grown up expecting non-diegetic or extra-diegetic music and sound in cinema and in video games. So that ties into suspension of disbelief. Lots of theories float around. So we're comfortable accepting that level of unreality. But again, it depends what you're trying to do. Certain genres of games, certain genres of film, certain purposes of virtual environments are going to hugely dictate whether you want to be predominantly using diegetic sound or predominantly not using diegetic sound, or whether you can get away with, for the most part, I found transdiegetic effects to be a bit cheesy. So I don't find them very useful at all. And I quite like, in terms of design, more purist approaches. So it doesn't matter whether you're using diegetic or extra diegetic, but the more fascinating experiences I talked about earlier, some of the most interesting solutions are, or the best solutions are interesting, and they're interesting because they're unique. They're trying to use diegesis in a way which has not really been done before. So it's subverting there's no prior expectation for the user to go, all right, I expect this to happen. They're taken out of their comfort zone, And again, let's go back to priming, I suppose, in many ways. Again, all of these things are desperately connected. But so a good example of that would be something where you create either a 360 film or a game or some sort of experience where everything in the environment is as much as possible diegetic. So and like going back to user interfaces as well, trying to create a game environment where nothing is extra diegetic. There's no single, I don't know how you guys feel about games, but I personally, these days, I hate an interface. I hate a non-diegetic interface. I hate particle effects that clearly don't look like they're emerging from the world, that they're just kind of like overlays to signify something. I want every visual and auditory element of that virtual world to really feel like it is of that virtual world, not an overlay to it. And I find overlays make things just look messy, conceptually messy, and they give me this multi-layered sense of presence. I'm not present in the virtual world or the physical world. I'm present a bit in both of them. Whereas something a bit more purely focused on one more than the other, for me, in terms of what I want, that's good diegesis. But does everybody want that in every context? No, absolutely not. So that then ties into what we have to do with nearly every single one of our, particularly VR and AR projects, is bespoke audience analysis. There's no project where we can kind of rest on our laurels and just go, all right, we assume this is what they want, so we'll give it to them. Before we design anything, usually we have to trawl quite a lot through quite a lot of data to try and get a sense of what those expectations, prior experiences, and so on. And build to that. It would be lovely if there was a generic good or bad, but no, in my experience anyway, there isn't, and you have to do lots and lots of lovely groundwork before you even start building a thing. Sorry, it was a very long answer to your question.
No, that's great. I appreciate that there are many variables to consider, diegetic or not. Speaking of the models that, or what is it, the theories that you presented before, what's the process of reaching or constructing this theory? And there were a few slides before where you had the priming effect and these kind of things. I'm wondering, like, what if someone wants to develop sort of similar theory regarding sound or otherwise, what's the process?
That's a wonderful question. And my advice, this is personal advice, unfortunately. I can't tell you what the right, I feel like I'm dodging every answer really with it. Well, it depends, but unfortunately, I can't give you a better answer. What I can tell you is what worked for me and what I do. Because I must admit, I didn't type into Google, at any point throughout my PhD or any of my postdoc work, how do you build a conceptual framework, or what are the methods and approaches to building a conceptual framework or a conceptual model. I think I was just drawn to it. Now, I don't know what kind of development experience anyone in the audience has. I would feel like a total fraud if I called myself a programmer. But I love elements of programming, but what I'd freely admit would be I love visual scripting. And I work really happily with like the Bolt on Unity or Blueprints in Unreal, but the idea of having nodes, little bits floating around and then basically just joining them up. That makes an awful lot of sense in terms of how I process logic, how I make sense of how things are connected. So building kind of conceptual models, I think in that regard very much fits my personality. So I may be one of those people who didn't really need to think too much about it. I think if you are, say, a text-based programmer, this might actually, in reverse, be something which you wouldn't find as easy, and you would need to put more thought into it up front. But I cheated. I was lazy. Didn't feel a need to. But in terms of what the process was, literally, I mean, it would be a case of, I would be reading through various papers and finding the nodes, so the little points, what I saw to be the nodes, or the variables, the features, the usually single words or short phrases that denoted a particular concept that I could visualize as effectively as a node, something I could put in a box and then shove on a 2D on a screen, and then I would literally just it would look a lot more like that. You would just have these nodes all over the place, and then ironically, I'm going back to what I did for the book. Really, it was a qualitative methodology. It was you'd start with all of your various the big pile of data, all the stuff that you're reading, and then you would go through a process of classification. You would look for coding. It was called, wasn't it? So you'd go through an order of codifying everything, creating these little nodes based on kind of short, succinct phrases or individual words, and then effectively just throwing them in a visual space. Or that was my technique, throwing them in a visual space, and then just it becomes a jigsaw, or almost like, right, what's the connection? Let's just broadly group these. All right, these are quite similar. Let's move these over here. These are quite similar. Let's move these over here. And then does a singular term or title kind of emerge from those things that I've grouped together that describes what brings them all together? So, VR system emerges as a thing that connects mixed reality from design and materials and standards and virtual environment, and user experience emerges from bringing to the diegesis and fun and flow and presence and so on. Again, these are my interpretations. So it's like my levels, how I've grouped them and the classifications which I've formed. And then the final step after you've got those things connected is to then start, and again, it should never look as messy as this, so I think these sorts of models are better, is to try and make kind of multi-layered connections. So I use the smaller arrows for usually the more fine connections between smaller amounts of features, and then if it's bigger arrows, that's broader effects, where things are a little bit more vague, a little bit messier, and I'm making broader, more sweeping statements, because the information I don't feel is refined or granular enough to say, yeah, A leads to B, the data isn't showing a causal relationship, so I can't do that. And then the last thing to mention is the arrows. So I would always try where possible to use arrows to indicate what I, at least hypothetically, what I believe the direction of the effect is. So rather than, this is the problem I do have with these sorts of models, where it is just kind of, there's lots of stuff going on and everything connects to everything. That is, I think, as I mentioned earlier, there is a way in which that is practically useful. But in terms of getting a sense of exactly how a system might work, a real world system might work, obviously the direction, the flow is going to be really important to that. So again, all of this here, totally hypothetical. Is it true that specific psychological vulnerability affects personal fear profile without it directly then going straight back into specific psychological vulnerability? Don't know. It's a hypothetical way in which, broadly speaking, you can see how most of these things are still interconnected. Nothing just sits in isolation in the corner and then affects lots of things with nothing feeding back. Nearly everything is subject to influence by something else. That's the whole principle of emergence theory. But the idea is for it to be useful, you need to acknowledge that, or to try and present these sorts of things in a sense of some things are more connected than others, or the connection between them is more powerful or more meaningful, and therefore needs to be attended to in a different way when it comes to your design. That's quite personal. I know that does relate to some broader theory there in terms of coding and stuff, but that's what I've described there is very much what worked for me. So I can't promise that would necessarily be if you just followed that as an ABC, that it would be as straightforward for everybody.
That's great.
Would you say that, in your view, that an intuitive system is sort of intrinsically linked to priming, and that they cannot sit sort of apart from each other? Like, they can they be mutually exclusive, priming and having an intuitive system, or do you base the fact that the system is intuitive because a user has been primed in whatever way?
I haven't thought about that, so I'm thinking I'm thinking on my feet, but instinctively I would say no. I think they could be. There would be absolutely certain cases where they could be, for all intents and purposes, mutually exclusive. That you don't need to worry about one impacting the other. You can focus on one, or focus on the other, and it will be fine in the context of the system that you're trying to create. And I think that the connection that I've drawn, which kind of makes them feel like they're very heavily overlapped, is quite strongly influenced by the context of the type of things that I'm doing. So in the context of a horror video game, survival horror video game, I think that those connections are going to be very, very strong, and that this sort of principle is therefore very relevant. I'm trying to think off the top of my head of some other circumstance where I think that you could really safely think of them as mutually exclusive, and I've got my brain is blank, but I believe it would be that it could absolutely be the case. That I'm not saying it necessarily. I wouldn't even dare to guess how likely it is, or what particular context that would be. They could be mutually exclusive, but I think it would be a bold statement to suggest that, oh no, they're always totally linked, no matter what, and you always have to think about them all as equally kind of a bidirectional thing. I think in some cases you could, even at least in practice, even if in theory or in the underlying reality, those things are always having at least a tiny connection. It's always about meaningful difference, isn't it, or a meaningful connection? If that the power of that connection, or A affecting B, is something nobody notices, who cares? You don't need to worry about it. It's not, from a design perspective, it doesn't become, it's not relevant. You need to worry about the connections which are meaningful, in the same way, like health interventions that technically improve your health by 0.1%. I mean, that's great, but who notices a 0.1% improvement in their health? What does that even mean? So the meaningfulness of any sort of intervention is extremely important. And I would argue in many cases, in many fields, including my own, underappreciated in some cases, sort of thing. So, just because you're making a difference, or it is a variable, does not mean it's necessarily meaningful, particularly from the perspective of essentially from the perspective of the user. But no, I'm going to go away and think about that, because I want to think, is there an example of something where I can say, yes, there you go, total mutual exclusivity between those two factors, and I can't think of one. If anyone else can you let me know? Because that's going to bug me now.
Thanks, buddy.
Thank you, Ahmed. If anyone has any questions, please let us know.
Yeah. Really enjoyable talk, Tom. One thing I wanted to know more about was the game, the experience, the Summoned. I was looking up for it. Is it published, or is it? Can I find more information about it?
There's not a great deal, I must admit. It literally just existed as a proof of concept. I think the only real additional presence of it online is that full video, which is on YouTube. So I mean, I don't even know.
Yeah, I was stalking your YouTube channel everywhere.
I don't even know what you type in. So I mean, it's. I think I labeled it as part of like what I called my XR 101 series, and it's just a summoned playthrough. But that's literally it. So I mean, the game experience itself is not available anywhere online. It all sits somewhere in the archives. I mean, the things ultimately that I'd like to revisit at some point, but at the moment, no, that very much existed as in terms of the actual game itself. I'm terrible at self-marketing. I'm terrible at getting stuff out there into the world. I create stuff and it just sits there and draw effectively. So that's all that there is at this point, anyway.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. for the talk and for the ideas you shared with us. It's really interesting, and we would love to hear more in the future and collaborate if there's a chance. And if you get to visit New Zealand, please do let us know. I'd love to host you here.
I very much appreciate that, and I would kind of effectively kind of reciprocate and swap that around. So yes, if there is anything with regards to collaboration, I'm always up for that. And it was very reassuring to when you mentioned that there's a considerable amount of overlap with these particular elements, because this doesn't just reflect what we do; it reflects what I really enjoy doing within the overall work we do. So if you say there's overlap specifically with this stuff, that's more opportunity for me to do the stuff I actually want to do. Because obviously there's lots of it. We all have to do little bits of research and various different duties in this career that sit a little bit outside, but this represents the stuff that I feel most passionately about. So whenever there's opportunities of collaboration in this area, that's always exciting. But also vice versa in terms of talks. If anyone has stuff which they think kind of overlaps and contributes and could feedback in that way, we have our own series of these sorts of things as well. So yes, it would be wonderful to stay in touch. And thank you very much for listening. I appreciate it.
So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.